So Howard agreed that I wouldn't introduce him again because I spoke about uh, parts of his huge amount of contributions to this um, conversation and other important conversations circling around computers, collaboration, learning, networks, platforms, communities, and other notions we dropped so often today and we hear about so often in public debate. Um, I'm really honored to again also to have Lee, to have Laza, and now to have Howard. All three together is what I was hoping to create here, this encounter, and to maybe give you a little nudge to speak about education too. So Howard, how about you move on, tell us what you have to say, and then after that, as we had it before, Clemens will give his response and we move into some sort of discussion based on your talk and also on other notions we were discussing before this afternoon. The floor is yours.
Okay, I'm going to go through some material pretty quickly, covering the last 10 years in which I've been engaged in teaching college students and within the university setting and others online using social media. I needed to have some kind of title, so I used Edupunk to kind of describe where I think things are going. I want to add that that's a term that Jim Groom, who came up with it, doesn't really use anymore, but the terms are not as important as what it designates. So I want to start out by framing this by saying that what's important is the pedagogy. And so much of failed attempts to reform education with technology is concentrated on the technology. The worldwide network and digital media in general do enable a pedagogy that predates the technology by quite a bit. So much of what I've learned and what I'm going to talk about goes back to John Dewey and Paulo Freire and Maria Montessori. The technology enables that kind of student agency and peer learning in ways that classrooms don't enable as well. And it also breaks the monopoly on learning that schools have had forever. So I'll get to that. And I really base this in the original vision that Doug Engelbart had, in which the technology was part of a system of humans using language artifacts, methodology, and training. So much attention is on the artifacts, but the way in which they're used and talked about and the way people learn to use them, I think is really what's important now. It's been called a new culture of learning, a cluster of different characteristics. I really like the book that Doug Thomas and John Seeley Brown wrote about it, so I'm going to adopt the different characteristics that they use to characterize this new culture of learning. Learner-centered, I think that you can do without teachers, but this doesn't mean that that teachers are useless or need to be totally eliminated. But and this is a psychological barrier for many teachers, putting the learner at the center and giving them agency that they haven't had in the traditional school-like hierarchy, I think is the first characteristic. Self-directed, there are so many ways that people can, using the technology, and if they have a teacher who has a kind of permissive pedagogy, can direct their learning and not simply just sit there and comply with the kind of learning that's fed to them. and here's a place where the technology really is important, is that increasingly it's social and peer-to-peer. Human learning has always been social, and if we had more time, we could talk about an argument that we are human largely because of our species' capability for social learning. Um, Inquiry-based. This is not so much about memorizing the facts and knowing the answers. This is these days, particularly with so much change and so much uncertainty about the veracity of information, it's about knowing how to ask questions. Collaborative, and I would characterize that as working together on a project, but also cooperative. And I'd say that the difference between collaborative and cooperative is that in cooperative learning, the learners understand that they are co-responsible for each other's learning. They're not just doing their segment of their task. Networked, socially networked, and technically networked. I started thinking about this a long time ago. I wrote this article on virtual communities in 1987 for Whole Earth Review, and one of the things that was most exciting to me was the fact that I got to know people like Lee online, and I got to know what they were interested in, and if I found something that I thought would be interesting to them, I could share it. And that seemed to be a kind of magical cooking pot, because if I shared it with a few people, many more than a few people would share with me. And I'll have to say that I don't know how many years we're talking about, 35 years later, it's still true. In 1995, for a big convention, I worked with a graphic designer to create a mock-up of a University of the Future, 1995. And the idea is that you would have incoming and outgoing video, and I think this is the thing that Liza had mentioned before. Students in this scenario could get together and hire a teacher. And I think that we're at the cusp of seeing that becoming much more prevalent. So 10 years ago, it seemed to me that students were becoming immersed in what we now call social media. That name didn't exist back then. And universities weren't dealing with all of the issues that arise from our use of social media around identity and self-presentation, around community, public sphere, social capital, a lot of big issues that are rooted in different fields. And I felt it was important to bring the knowledge from sociology and social psychology and economics and political science together so that students would be able to evaluate the changes in themselves and the world that their use of social media triggers. And so it only made sense that if we're going to be talking about social media issues, we should extend the conversation beyond the classroom and use social media. So I put together a number of different media, that many of which don't really exist now. Social text, wiki. I used a forum from another vendor, and I used chat and blogs from different sources. And one of the things that the students said to me was, well, they're learning new things. That's what you do in a course. But also I'm asking them to do it in a new way and use new media, and all of the different formats had different user interfaces and different logins. So I entered a contest that MacArthur Foundation was sponsored, and received a small award, most of which went to a developer to create what I call the social media classroom, that enabled us to have chat, forums, blogs, and wikis on different tabs of a browser. So you can see in this mock-up, this is the forum. And I'll just say simply right now that the forum is about the voice of the group. It's like taking that when a class discussion really takes off and then the bell rings and you got to move on. It's continuing that discussion after that face-to-face period. So in between class meetings, we continued our discussion through the voice of the group. These are the things that the group wants to discuss. But also, excuse me, each student had a blog. And as you can see, as blogs today, you can embed links, you can embed media players in them. So it's really a multimedia conversation. The blogs are about reflecting on learning, and it's about the individual voice. There are comments, and quite often the comment threads around the blog posts were as lively or more lively than those in the forum, but it is the individual who determines the agenda for their blog discussion. So it's a combination of the group voice and the individual voice online in between class meetings. And we use the wiki. This is probably the hardest thing for students to get. Collaboration is discouraged in schools. It's considered cheating. And editing each other's work is something that people are reluctant to do. So we use this for collaborative work. We also used a lot of different tools, a lot of experiments with things like social bookmarking and annotation. And I'll have to say that at the beginning, I was confident about my knowledge of the subject matter, but I had no training as a teacher. And I was afraid of my students finding out how little I knew about teaching. I started asking them how these experiments with different media were going. It took a while for them to understand. I really wanted to know how they felt about it. And I realized then that if you, as a teacher, if you jump over that fear barrier of exposing the fact that you're not the authority on everything, that the students will open up to you a little bit more, and you can learn things together. So my teaching evolved, and the tools that I used and the way we use those tools evolved in a conversation with the student.
Participant to join the conference.
A couple of years in, I learned that I'm sorry, there's some weird disembodied voice there, threw me off. A couple of years in, I learned that we could ignite an exciting learning community, and the students echoed excitement, and I got that excitement in the anonymous evaluations that I got at the end of the year. So I was then able to say, as the authority standing in front of the class who is expected to know everything, I could say, we're going to do this together. We're going to become a learning community. I can't guarantee that the magic is going to happen, but I can tell you truthfully that it has happened. And somehow it's like casting a spell. The students will go along with that. It doesn't always happen. You can't always get students to break out of the individual achievement and try to do cooperative learning, but sometimes it happens, and it is exciting. This was the way the classroom looked when I started, and then it moved to something like this. You know, simply moving the chairs in a circle is a huge deal, but also notice who's standing up. It's a student. You know, I used to tell my students, I didn't invent this, but I think it's a good metaphor. If you took a warrior from 1,000 years ago and you put them on a battlefield today, they would die very quickly. If you took a surgeon from 1,000 years ago and you put them in a modern surgical operating theater, they really wouldn't know what to do. If you took students and teachers from 1,000 years ago and you put them in a classroom, everyone would know where to sit and what to do and what to expect. I started asking my students to co-teach with me, and that's what this young woman is doing right now. And it was a process. We met together and we came up with a plan, and they helped me with that. And I guess you could boil this whole thing down to encouraging agency of the learners. They're not used to having agency. They're used to listening for what the teacher's going to put on the test. I ended up saying, well, what's on the test is going to depend on you. For example, the co-teachers and the other students would use the wiki to create a lexicon of words and phrases that came up in our reading and in our discussions, and define them ourselves. And eventually the final exam consisted of write something using the words in the lexicon in context. So the answer to the inevitable question, what's going on the final exam, was, well, that's up to you. I also asked students to do mind maps because they break out of the kind of serial thinking and enable you to do lateral thinking. They're also very visual thinking, and also enable you to see connections between things. So these are all different kinds of mind maps that my students did. When I was not teaching at Berkeley or at Stanford, I one night decided, well, what if I just use these tools online and taught people something? So I put it out on Twitter. Would people be interested in learning about mind amplifiers? Would you pay $100 for it? And I started what I called Rheingold U, which was a very interesting experiment because we never met face to face, and quite often there were people on 3 or 4 continents in our face to face in our synchronous meetings. So we would meet using technologies like the one that we're using now, but also the forums and the blogs and the wikis. Around 2011, I was noticing that there were more and more online platforms for people to teach each other. And so after moving from the classroom to strictly online, it seemed to me like a good experiment would be to eliminate the teacher altogether. I was asked to do a lecture at University of California at Berkeley, and part of that lecture was to engage faculty and students afterwards in some kind of face-to-face seminars. So I proposed that that we come up with a handbook for peer learning, or we at least start a handbook. I mean, we've got YouTube, we've got all of the media that we're using right now. We have forums and blogs and wikis and Wikipedia and Google. Why not get a group of people together to learn something and divide the labor and learn it together? So I did meet with students and faculty at Berkeley, and I also brought my laptop and I had it open like we're doing right here, and invited anyone else in the world to join us. Interestingly, we started doing this online, we used wikis and forums, and after about 3 weeks, all of the Berkeley faculty and students dropped out, and the core members of the team, which still exists, I guess now 6 years later, 5 years later, are people I had never met from all over the world. They're from Mexico, the UK, Japan, and Brazil. And so I adopted the name Pedagogy. I think it conveys what it's about. And we created this peer-to-peer learning handbook. If you go to pedagogy.org, you will see that it has mutated. I dropped out of the group after a couple of years. I dropped back in every once in a while, but I started it and I pushed the boulder up the hill, but it's really run by the people who have been attracted to it. You can download the handbook as a PDF for free. You can get a paper-bound book sent to you for I think about $20. And then a couple of years ago, I encountered something called DS-106. DS stands for Digital Storytelling. This was a course that was taught by Jim Groom at the University of Mary Washington. And by the way, I didn't find much support from the top down at either Berkeley or Stanford, and that's another story. And I really think that the universities of Mary Washington are where we're going to see a lot of this pedagogical innovation using technology coming from. DS-106 has the usual 20 students in a classroom, but it's also open to everybody in the world. And that's where Edupunk came in. The idea was, let's break out of the learning management systems, not only do we not want to be owned by some uh, learning management company, but we want students to take on the agency of being publishers and learn how to do it. So, Group asked his students to claim a domain name and lease a slice of a server and install and configure their own WordPress blogs, their own wikis, and used an aggregator to bring the RSS feeds together. So you could see who was just in your class at the university, or you could also see the stream of thousands of people from around the world. We've heard a lot about MOOCs. The MOOCs that we've heard so much about are mostly the old model. This is one in which the students really run the show. So I started requiring that from my Stanford students before the term started. I asked them to use the uh, Reclaim Hosting was what they started at University of Mary Washington. Reclaimhosting.org enables you for $25 to claim a domain and get a slice of server and configure it and set up your own blog. So I retired from Stanford and stopped teaching at Berkeley a few years ago, and that's the very swift version of the last 10 years. Oh, okay, so Lee's comment, the model of the classroom is fairly recent. Medieval University only had lectures and meetings with teachers. Although, if you think about it, the 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 lectures at the Sorbonne and Oxford and Cambridge, that was before print, and books were very valuable. They were chained to the lectern, and someone stood it up and read it to everybody else, and everybody else listened. So that's sort of what I meant was the lecturer stands in front of the class and talks, and everybody else sits and faces them and is quiet. So, Clement, do you want to respond? And else, I'm looking at the chat as well.
which was in fact not even a colonization, but really a destruction of the agora, changing the geometry, changing the topology from many to many, and one to many in small groups, changing that to a one to many in the total group. And I think the project we face is to recover the practices and expectations of the agora using electronic communications and whatever else we can find. Now, one thing I also wanted to mention, based on what Howard was saying, I just wanted to mention that the next thing I'm doing involves designing hardware for STEM, science, technology, education, math. It's a very hot rubric under which learning is being funded, usually learning involving technology. And what I've come across, almost by accident, is that I can design a thing that the kids can program with their hands, but because, well, I'm actually doing that reverse engineering the design of chips, and chips include in them a diagnostic port, a means for someone outside to look inside and see what is going on inside the chip. And it became obvious that I could incorporate this in the device. Now it's no longer a chip. It's built for kids to use with their hands. But the trick is that to include a mentoring port, which requires the development of a mentoring superstructure using the web, and the technology for in getting there and is all developed and is not hard to implement down at the bottom level. But what we need to do is figure out and develop the technology, the meta technology of mentoring from afar, mentoring anonymously, and then breaking down anonymity as the process progresses. In this case, there's no better way to learn something than to teach it. And this provides a general opportunity, in theory, for people who are attempting to achieve higher levels of learning to develop their knowledge by engaging in mentoring without having to go through all the physical inconvenience of going to a place and having to develop personal relationships with people you don't necessarily like and who don't like you. So we have this opportunity coming up, and I hope that we're going to make use of it. If I may,
Well, if there's no, I mean, I would just like to come back to the agora just quickly, because that relates to the first question, which is I mean, it's a mean one and a tricky one. It's about what do we How do we define the social? Because in Howard's action in the virtual community, of course, in introduction, you talk about the technological utopianism called the electronic agora. So, and I'm wondering if we really should go back to the idea of a community / agora. Because I mean, the Greek agora was, of course, and that's going back to participation. Of course, it's always a thing about inclusion and exclusion. So the agora only exists because women were excluded, non-free men were excluded. So I'm thinking this is like something I really try to get my hand around. How can we go beyond the notion of a community and trying to build something which is a society enhanced by technology, thinking more about really old terms like digital solidarity, these kind of things. How can we get beyond the community and go into society? And this is like what I'm thinking. So personally, I don't think that the agora is like the thing where we should go or go back.
Yeah, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about communities. I agree we need to go beyond it, but I don't think people naturally segregate themselves. They naturally tend to want to spend some time with people who look like them, speak the same language. It's very tiring to be with people who are always challenging your own sense of identity, which is part of why these agoras were exclusive, because they become meeting places for people. I mean, we talk about opinion bias or online, where you only read the stuff of people who agree with you. I think that's going to happen. So rather than fight it, can we not create spaces for both, so that there is a place to go and relax in a community of like minds, like bodies, like emotions, like spirits, and also channels where you can educare, be led out of that home space and into spaces where you are enlarged, you encounter people who are entirely different from yourself. And right now, that's going to include encountering artificial intelligences. It's going to, and historically it's always involved encountering people from different communities, but also encountering different species. In a sense, we're at a tipping point, at a catastrophe boundary, where we have to let some new concepts emerge from the system that we're in. And I think part of the reason we're struggling so hard right now is we're trying to take the concepts that we have and apply them in a new context, instead of kind of jumping that cliff and saying what's going to emerge in the new concept, in the new context.
Had to come back into the room. I fortunately got the
I
opportunity
have a response or a comment from Jeremy.
to take over leadership because Gordon French had to step away.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm quite sure I'm adding problems to problems, and I'm sorry for that. But we dropped out the name of Dewey and for his achievement in pedagogy. And if we look at what he did in political philosophy, and if we take his stance, he would say something like, we are reversing the problem. We don't need to build a space so people can gather. It's because you have a group of people concerned that the space will come after and will be built. And so the agora is not about having a space together. It's about having a group of people concerned about taking public decisions together and having power to exclude other people from it. And so I wonder how much we think here about building infrastructure in order to allow people to gather, but maybe it's, I'm not saying it's either the first, either the second possibility, but it's both together, yeah.
And I think that
Lee, was a hand raise?
I do not believe in the approach of saying, well, just make the minds meet and then all the rest of it will take care of itself. I'm sorry if I'm
it's your turn if you want.
What you said, but that's what I thought I heard. And we do need to explore, find out what works, expand it, engage in this process of ongoing design.
Jeremy, do you want to respond to that? No?
We have time?
Yeah, go ahead.
I didn't say exactly that. Indeed, I was more emphasizing the fact that we were here overemphasizing the infrastructure, and that's probably a new thing. I think Riscalti has a good concept with the recursive public. That's how he qualifies geek, hackers, and computer programmers, and that's the idea that they're able to modify the condition of the possibility, namely the condition of one of the condition of possibility of the existence of a hacker virtual community is the network itself, and then they're able to grasp the network. So he calls that recursive public, and that would be maybe a big difference, because everybody can destroy a building with a riot or a revolution and make a square, but building technical infrastructure like a network makes that you have this division between people who have skill and people who have no skill, and who are not recursive public. So that may be a difference indeed.
Reactions?
Hi. I want to react. I'd like to react earlier to this notion of communities and getting beyond it. I think it's worthwhile recalling that in biological evolution, old structures and ways of doing things aren't left behind. They aren't discarded, but something new comes into being. And certainly it's not news that when a new medium emerges, people tend to see it in light of previous media. So cinema took a while to evolve its language, even though at the beginning most of it was nailing a camera to a stage and then recapitulating theater. And I think that we're in such an early stage of such a rapid growth of not just the technology, but the proliferation of social forms that are emerging, that we need to keep in mind that something new, many new things are emerging, and community and networks are not going to disappear. We do, I think, have a collision between the capacity to communicate with people who think very differently from ourselves, and the instinct and habit to curate our social sphere to include almost entirely people who are like us, or people with whom we agree. The collision is that, well, let's say, for example, you've got a life-threatening disease, or you are breeding a rare kind of dog. Well, maybe nobody in your neighborhood or community has that disease or is interested in that particular interest, whether it's a dog or a car or any one of a million things. But you can find them online. You can connect with people, and I'm sure everybody here has participated in forums online with people who share a particular interest, in which people begin to care about each other and have relationships. If you start talking about politics, however, among that group, you run into the same problem. And I cannot extrapolate, but in the United States, we have an extreme issue online of people, the deterioration of the public sphere in terms of not really having a model for people who disagree to have civil argument. So maybe there's a way to design the media to support that or enable that, but I see it as particularly an educational problem, and it's got to start in the classroom young. How can we get people to talk to each other about their differences without descending into ad hominems and invective? I mean, it's become a cliche. Don't read the comments because they're so awful. We can do better than that, but how?
Marcel and Lily, you want to say something, and then I would ask everybody to maybe think if you still have something to say. Otherwise, Liza and me would do a wrap up and an outlook on where to move next and close the event. But of course, if you have anything else to say, let's make time for that. Marcel.
I like what Lily said, and unfortunately, I can't reconstruct that. Anyway, I think that